I study recipes all the time from the 18th century, 300-year-old recipes, and so many of the cookbooks are complicated, high-end, very, very expensive dishes for the elite of the time period. But there are also recipes that work for the lowest of the low, and that's what we're talking about in this episode today. We still eat this today, but it goes by a different name. In fact, probably a half a dozen different names. This, in the time period, was called hasty pudding. They had other names for it too, but a hasty pudding, this is a pudding made in haste. It's quick, it's a quick dish, and it turns out to be the kind of dish that any person could make. So even say the soldiers in the Revolutionary War, they had very few cooking skills, but they could make hasty pudding easily and simply, and they did. We're gonna make two different versions. The kind that the soldiers would make, and this high-end version. In the 18th century, Hannah Glasse creates the quintessential 18th century cookbook called The Art of Cookery. And in this cookbook are a couple of different versions of hasty pudding, and she has one that is for the high class. It is called To Make a Fine Hasty Pudding, and it's definitely got a twist. So hasty pudding is generally a grain that's ground up, either in a flour form, a meal form, or almost a cut grain. Any of these will work. And we basically boil it long enough for it to expand and make a nice, let's say, very, very thick porridge. So our standard oatmeal of today would be a version of a hasty pudding. But they would also make what we would call cornmeal mush. Same thing, hasty pudding. But in Great Britain, wheat was the classic kind of grain that you would use, at least in England, and they would make it from straight up flour. That makes a kind of a pasty version that isn't great. This recipe tries to attack that idea of how can we use wheat flour but still create something with some tooth that just doesn't turn into sort of, I don't know, wallpaper paste. Hannah Glasse's To Make a Fine Hasty Pudding. Break an egg into fine flour, and with your hand work up as much as you can into a stiff paste as is possible. Then mince it up as small as herbs to the pot, as small as if it were to be sifted. Then let a quart of milk a-boiling and put it in the paste so cut. Put in a little salt, a little beaten cinnamon, some sugar, a piece of butter as big as a walnut. Stir it all one way. Don't go back and forth. Stir it all one way, and when it is as thick as you would have it, stir in such another piece of butter, then pour it into your dish and stick in pieces of butter here and there and send it up to the table hot. This sounds like a complicated thing. It isn't terribly complicated. But what's so incredibly interesting here is that what she does is sort of make a pasta out of this flour to turn it into this hasty pudding. Kind of, let's say, a version of today's oatmeal, right? So how can we turn that flour that's really, really fine into something that has little bits into it? So that's exactly what we're gonna do here. We're gonna make this kind of instant pasta, and then we're gonna boil it up with the milk and turn it into this hasty pudding. Our first step here is to mix up an egg with our flour. Again, we of course don't have any amounts. We just have to kind of play this by ear, but we're making a very stiff paste. As soon as we have the stiff paste made with just the flour and the egg, we'll roll that out thinly. After it's cut in little strips, we'll cut those strips into little smaller pieces. She says, remember to make it as small as it could almost be sifted. So we're making very, very small little pieces here. Once those are made, we're going to get a pot boiling with some milk. We have to be careful as we heat up this milk. It could burn at the bottom of the pan. We have to start stirring it right away. Once our milk is up to temperature, not boiling, but pretty hot, we're gonna put in a little bit of salt, a little bit of ground cinnamon, a little bit of sugar, and of course, some butter. Then we can pour in our pieces of flour that's turned into, I guess you would call it pasta. And then we will stir this. Continue to stir it continually as she calls for in this recipe. You do not want the milk to burn or anything else to burn. It will start to thicken up after a while. And then we can pour it out into our serving bowl, put in a couple more pieces of butter, just for looks basically, and then it's ready to eat. Here is our fine hasty pudding, and I will not lie, this smells really, really good. I have never cooked this particular recipe before, so I'm very intrigued. What is it going to taste like? Now, it's flour, it's eggs, it's, how could it be wrong? But it doesn't look necessarily appetizing. It's kind of lumpy and, great looking, but boy, if it tastes as good as it smells, then it's gonna be really good. So let's find out. It's got a great, interesting texture and some really good flavors too. So this one is really, really good. Let's not be too confused about the term pudding, and we talked about puddings here on the channel before. Today, of course, pudding means something very different than what pudding meant in the 18th century. Today, in America, somebody says pudding, and a lot of times we're thinking something like a custard. And that's really not necessarily pudding for the 18th century. Sometimes pudding is used very generically to mean something like a dessert. But in the 18th century, it had a lot to do with its texture and how it was made. So we think of puddings being sweet, but most of the puddings in the 18th century were actually savory puddings. Now, a lot of the puddings were boiled. They made boiled puddings, and we've done those here on the channel before. Kind of like a softball or even bigger, this sort of bread-like texture. Or they made puddings and they were baked puddings. Very similar to the kind of thing you would do with the boiled pudding, but you just bake it instead. But there were also these kinds of puddings which were called sometimes stirabouts. They're hasty puddings in that we can make them quickly. Those other puddings, whether they're boiled or baked, would take hours to make. Whereas this hasty pudding, hey, 20 minutes, half hour, you're ready to eat it. Now, a hasty pudding made with this, which is cornmeal, maize meal, that's a completely American kind of thing. And if we look at some of the research, we can find that they're talking about making puddings out of cornmeal very early on. Even in the 17th century, it was one of the easy ways to use this very prolific grain in the New World. We make a hasty pudding out of this, but usually it goes by the name of samp, or sapon, or some other names for this particular dish. I don't know what we would call it except for cornmeal mush. Here's a book in 1803 that's talking specifically about using cornmeal for this hasty pudding. It says the cheapest and most advantageous method of using Indian corn as food is by making the flour of it into hasty pudding in a manner very similar to water porridge, a food made of oatmeal in the north of England and in Scotland. A quantity of water is proportioned to the quantity of hasty pudding intended to be made. It is put over the fire in an open iron pot or kettle, and a proper quantity of salt for seasoning. The pudding is being previously dissolved. As soon as the water begins to boil, the Indian meal is stirred into it little by little with the spatula of wood for the purpose, or a spoon, whilst the water is kept continually boiling. He goes on to talk about making this very, very simple dish. And really, this particular dish, it feeds everyone in North America. Whether they're the poorest of the poor or the rich, it would show up on every one of these tables, because cornmeal was used all throughout the colonies because it is so inexpensive and so prolific. Let's compare this cornmeal mush to the last hasty pudding and see how it turned out. I did add just a touch of sugars to be similar to the other recipe. Well, I mean, it's good, but it doesn't have that same texture. It doesn't have those nice big kind of lumps that were really actually great in the other one. But if this is what you are eating every day, you would love it. This is definitely the more simple and less expensive version of a hasty pudding. Definitely a soldier in the time period or any very, very poor person in the colonies would have something like this. Probably made with water, but still ultra simple. This is the dish that anyone would be able to have available to them.